Hey, I've been doing some digging. I'm going to share with you some of the stuff that I found. Hopefully, you can draw some useful conclusions from it. This is Colonel Marshhair presenting What is Hebrew, Really? Hey, this is Colonel Marshhair. We're going to talk about the thing we call Hebrew. What is it? Where did it come from? And what's this whole thing about? So, first off, Hebrew is the language that most Bible believers and religionists assume is the language of the Bible and the language of the patriarchs, and it's the best way to study the linguistic etymology of concepts in the Bible. It's also assumed that it's the language of the Israel of the Bible. Are these assumptions based on verifiable facts or a muddled, undefined purview that was effective because of the general lack of information available to the public? In this examination, we'll walk through some evidences from a linguistic science approach with help from biblical narrative, history, and some basic observations. And I'm going to try to keep it common language and not all sciencey. So let's see what's lurking at the bottom of this rabbit hole. First, let's be clear about what the current accepted beliefs about this enigmatic Hebrew language are. I'm trying to represent in this list the general public views and not so much what the scholars think. So, it's the language of the Jews. It's also another name for the Jews. Jew and Hebrew are basically the same thing. And because it's the language of the Jews, it's the language of the Bible. Some might say that it is the language of the Bible, so it became the language of the Jews. Since it's the language of the Bible, many believe it is the original language spoken even by Adam, and some go so far as to say by the angels and Yahweh himself. Many argue that it was a dead language for a certain contested amount of time, and still others argue that it was never a dead language. And that argument, I think, will probably never be settled, academically speaking. So, most biblical scholars believe that by learning the hidden meanings in the Hebrew language, they can understand the Bible even better. Many believe that the New Testament was originally written in Hebrew rather than Greek and are desperately looking for ancient scrolls to testify to this. And there have been some things. Don't get me wrong there. Generally, everyone agrees that if you want to understand Hebrew, you should refer to the Jews, who are the most adept at the meaning contained in the language. And the most important concept that confuses people, Hebrew is one pure language. It's not a generic term used to describe a mixed bag of different languages and dialects beginning from possibly about Abraham up to the current time. It's one pure, perfect language. So these 8 bullet points here, I think, are what the common average person on this planet thinks about Hebrew. Now, there's a lot of variation, so don't take it personally if you don't match perfectly or you know someone who this, that, or the other. This is just basic observation of the whole world in general, and I put it down on paper. So, deal with it. Now, let's look at what academic records tell us about this language, the language of Hebrew. Let's start from recent events and work backward according to accepted academic teachings. In the 19th and 20th centuries, Hebrew, called Ivrit Hadassah by those who speak it, and more accurately known as Modern Hebrew, or New Hebrew in English, is a language that was revived in the 19th and 20th centuries from a Canaanite branch of the Semitic language family that was the flourishing, commonly spoken language of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah between about 1200 to 586 BC. It is the language of the state of Israel. Medieval Hebrew, from about the 4th to the 13th century AD, was not a common language but was used mainly as a liturgical language by rabbis, poets, and scholars. Liturgy simply means public worship stuff. It had many differences from older forms of Hebrew that affected sentence structure, grammar, and syntax, included new lexical forms. Some of the lexical items were borrowed from other languages like Aramaic, Greek, and Latin. During this period of time, known as the Medieval Ages in Europe and as the Golden Age of Jewish culture in Spain, in the Muslim Iberian Peninsula, Jewish grammarians incorporated Arabic grammar into medieval Hebrew and dubbed it Purified Hebrew. This Purified Hebrew was apparently used later by Italian Jewish poets. Are you getting what's happening here? I mean, let me go over that slowly. In the 19th and 20th centuries, New Hebrew was invented from a dead language that was a Canaanite language. Now, if you know anything from the Bible, you know Canaanite is not Semitic. But in linguistics, the Canaanite is a branch of the Semitic language family. That's where modern Hebrew came from. Medieval Hebrew wasn't a common language. It was used for religious practices, kind of like Latin in the Catholic Church. Only those with the training actually knew what it said. And it had a lot of differences from older forms of Hebrew. The sentence structure, the grammar, the syntax, the lexicon was all different. It's all changed somehow. Okay? And during this Middle Ages, in the Muslim area of the Iberian Peninsula, which is right here, and I don't know if you can see it, but over here in a little dash right there at the tip of that arrow is Israel. Over here is where Jesus said to go to the lost tribes, and a whole bunch of the disciples went there. Some went down here into the east, called India in a lot of translations. They went to South India and Philippines, and then others went over here. These were known lost tribes areas. And this is where the medieval Iberian Peninsula Jews kind of reinvented another Hebrew into medieval Hebrew and used it for religion. Okay, I just want you to understand exactly what history is actually saying. Okay? Before medieval Hebrew was Mishnaic Hebrew, which is pretty much the language of the Talmud. Okay? And if you don't understand what Talmud is, you're going to have to look into it and open your eyes. When a practicing Jew says they follow Torah, they're actually referring to Talmud, unless they're not a good Jew and they actually do follow Torah. It's just a twisting up of the language. It's words that mean teachings and instructions. So if you say, do you follow instructions? They'll say yes. You didn't ask them which instruction they follow. You just said instruction. You understand? They're not lying. It's just we get confused because we don't know what we're asking. Okay, so Mishnaic Hebrew is the written language of the Gemara and Mishnah, which is to say the Talmud. This Hebrew is divided into three forms: Classical Hebrew, Amoraic Hebrew, which was literary only, and Mishnaic Hebrew proper, or Tannaitic Hebrew, or early Rabbinic Hebrew, which was the spoken language. This Mishnaic Hebrew was used primarily from the 1st to the 4th centuries during the Roman occupation following the destruction of Jerusalem and the Temple. Now, if you understand the Psalm 83 war, you're going to start putting things together here. It is apparent that it became popularized because of the Bar Kokhba revolt in 132 to 135 AD. At this point, the records indicate that the national language was switched from Aramaic to this Mishnaic Hebrew. It only lasted for about a century, though, and Talmudic commentaries in the Jerusalem Talmud, about 350 to 400 AD, as well as in the Babylonian Talmud writings called Gemara, about 500 AD, were generally written in Aramaic. But some of the Gemara was still written in Aramaic Hebrew. Amoraic Hebrew. And pushing farther back in time, what we call Biblical Hebrew, Ivrit Mikrait, or Lishon HaMikra, also known as Classical Hebrew. There's no indication that is solid to suggest the earliest use of this language. However, it is said to have been used from the 10th century BC up until about 70 AD. It was used geographically by Israelites in Israel between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. Okay? What they're trying to say is it was used in Israel. And they give geographic reference. These are little things that you start to notice. Like you notice in Mishnaic Hebrew, no geographic reference. In medieval Hebrew, the only geographic reference had to do with when they started using a certain form of a certain grammaric alteration in poetry. And then in modern Hebrew, it's geographic but by national boundary of the state of Israel. So only in biblical Hebrew do they point out geography to say where it was spoken. And if you study anthropology, linguistic anthropology, cultural anthropology, any of it, you know that that's really odd. When you talk about a spoken language, you're talking about a culture, because language is indelibly tied to culture. Culture is indelibly tied to geographic locations and the people that lived in them. So when you talk about origins of language and don't bring up geography, that should raise some alarms. And that's the story of Hebrew. But finally, in biblical Hebrew, we get some geography. However, biblical Hebrew has some interesting keynotes. Biblical Hebrew is known for revealing various stages of the Hebrew language. In other words, it evolved. Do you understand what I'm trying to say here? Sorry, I'm trying to fix my typo. Okay. So, biblical Hebrew is known for revealing various stages of the Hebrew language, with changes in consonantal structure and vocalic system. Okay, so the vocal utterances changed. The vocal alterations are widely known as the Nikud and were developed by the Masoretes in the Middle Ages. Biblical Hebrew also reveals some dialect differences, such as between the writers of the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. And if you're reading Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Amos, Obadiah, that shouldn't surprise you. The consonantal manuscripts were redacted in the Second Temple period. That's interesting. And the earliest forms are debatedly dated to the later 8th to early 7th centuries BC. So that's the earliest, 8th to 7th centuries BC. That's hundreds of years, not thousands. Okay? It gets more interesting. Biblical Hebrew was written with various alphabet systems. Sorry, I can't leave typos alone. It has to be fixed. The Phoenician alphabet was adopted at about the 12th century BC. You say, what? And that evolved into Paleo-Hebrew. Okay, now that's interesting because everyone keeps saying Paleo-Hebrew is the pure language of the Bible. But that came from Phoenician. You got to start wondering. At some point, when you're reading this history of Hebrew, you've got to start wondering. Okay? The Phoenician alphabet was adopted about the 12th century BC, which evolved into the Paleo-Hebrew alphabet. The Aramaic alphabet slowly but surely replaced the Paleo-Hebrew for most Jews, and eventually this alphabet became the basis for the modern Hebrew alphabet. I hope you're paying attention to the words used here. They pointed out very specifically that Biblical Hebrew was used geographically by Israelites in Israel between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. That's all of Israel, is the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. That's what that sentence is saying. They're being really sneaky about it so they don't raise alarms from the rabbis and get kicked out of their education institution and lose their career. Do you understand what's happening here? Israelites in Israel supposedly used this language. But you see, down here, most Jews started using the Aramaic alphabet. Why are they being so specific? Now we're only talking about Jews, which are the descendants of Syrian immigrants or Syrian exiles who returned, and the descendants of the wives and children that the Judeans, the Benjamites, and the Levites divorced and sent away during the days of Ezra and Nehemiah. Okay, so during the days of Ezra and Nehemiah, they divorced their wives and kids for no reason other than they thought the law told them to. Those kids ended up becoming kind of intermixed with their Syrian relatives. They lived in Syria in two cities called Sippar, which is books. They were two cities of books. On one side of the river is one book. On the other side of the river was another book. It's the same process you see now in Israel with Jews today. They have two books. It's the same system. Easy to trace this stuff. Anyway, back to what I wrote. Okay. Eventually, the Aramaic alphabet became the basis for modern Hebrew. Now that's weird because they try to say modern Hebrew is Hebrew, but it's based on Aramaic and what other languages? So the sounds of the spoken language are said to have been represented in written form with only consonants, no vowels. In the Middle Ages, various forms of using different letters to mark vowels were employed. Yeah, and I skipped a long explanation there because it doesn't really matter. They used all kinds of ways to mark vowel sounds for when you read what they thought was nothing but consonants. Okay? So it's also known that early biblical Hebrew had certain letters that had disputed articulations. So basically no one knew how to pronounce these letters. So they kind of got mixed and mashed. It also had 3 consonants that did not have representations in the alphabet. If you're not laughing right now, I don't know if I can help you. Okay, listen. Biblical Hebrew. They're saying at the time Biblical Hebrew was spoken, there were letters that people didn't know how to pronounce. And it had 3 letters that didn't have letters. You should be rolling on the floor laughing right now. And it had no vowels. Anyway, the vowel system changed over time and has a varied acceptance of how to use them in different transcriptions and traditions. So the vowel system just kind of went haywire with however local people wanted to do it. Now, if that hasn't confused you enough already, let's get into origins. The earliest mentions of the language we all know as Biblical Hebrew refer to it as the language of Canaan, not Hebrew. It's not called Hebrew by the early writers who talked about the language. So you can find this in Isaiah chapter 19, verse 18. Other Bible references call it the language of Judah or Yahudah, Judahite or Judean in 2 Kings 18:26. Interestingly, the rabbinical Jew historian Josephus records that the term Hebreos was used in the Hellenistic Greek period in his Antiquities 1. All right. I hope you're starting to put two and two together here. We'll keep going. In the Mishnah, which is part of the Talmud, in Gittin 9:8 and other Mishnaic passages, we finally see the term Hebrew actually used. No one knows where the term originated or why it began to be used. Everyone just guesses. Now, my best guess using linguistic traces is along the lines that it came from Eber, one of the descendants of Shem. Okay? And that makes the most sense because literally when you look at it in Greek and Latin and Egyptian and Aramaic and Hittite and Sumerian and all of it, it basically says Eber. Right? That's why they named it the Iberian Peninsula. It literally is Hebrew. It's the same word. Okay? So, because they thought the Jews were Hebrews. And maybe they are. Maybe Hebrew is just a bad word to use. Maybe Hebrew is Jew, and it's not a biblical term at all. That's one consideration to make. Although I do hold to the fact that Hebrew is a certain tribal descendant from Shem that Abraham was descended from, and thus Moses. And so they just say Israel is Hebraic, right? But Israel is not the only Hebrews. And I'll get into this in more detail later. All right. Jews began calling Hebrew the holy language in Mishnaic. Consider that for a moment. Okay, let's scroll back up and have a look here. If I can find it. Yep, here we go. In the Middle Ages, they took Arabic grammar, put it into medieval Hebrew, which was an amalgamation of different languages, right? From Canaanite. Okay. And they took Arabic grammar, put it in a Canaanite revivified alphabet system that they added sounds to from their spoken language, and they called that purified Hebrew. And then you see again in the Mishnaic passages using the word Hebrew, Jews began calling Hebrew the holy language. Basically, it means the pure tongue, the pure language. Same thing. Same thing they did in the Middle Ages. Just mash some dialects together, borrow letters from different languages, create an alphabet, add vowel sounds wherever you want to make the meaning that you want it to have, and then call it the perfect language. You should be shocked and dismayed if this is the first time you've heard of this. Okay? So you see in what I just talked about, this concise portrayal of academic knowledge. I didn't go into my added stuff was my opinion. What I read was all academic information. Anybody can find this in a million places, okay? This is a concise portrayal of academic knowledge. I could have gone a lot deeper, but if you're interested, that's a rabbit trail you can go down for yourself. That Hebrew isn't even really the language of the Bible. It was used to translate the Torah and Tanakh into languages that the readers understood. And you can back up that conclusion right there. In Daniel, when the king calls for the wise men, go look it up, read Daniel. What language did they speak to the king in? And then read Ezra and Nehemiah and try to figure out why Ezra was the only scholar of the law of Moses when they all had access to the book. None of them spoke the language it was written in. Do you understand? They didn't speak it and they didn't read it. Ezra tried to learn how to read it, became a scholar, an adept scholar of the law of Moses, because it was in a language that no one spoke. Moses did not write it in Hebrew. Okay? All right. According to real academic information, it was several dialects and reconstructions of ancient Canaanite languages. And if you pay attention to the biblical narrative, you already see the problem here. Canaanite is Hamite, not Shemite. It's not Semitic. Canaanite is the language that was spoken in the land before Israel got there. You understand? Now, the other side of that problem is, if you go read the narrative of Abraham very carefully, you start to realize that Abraham came from the east. Okay? Pay attention to it. He came from Ur of Chaldea, which, if you look it up, and the honest scholars will admit, no one really knows what Chaldee means. We know it was later applied to the Chaldees in Babylon. And then I would encourage you to look at, where did Babylon come from? And you'll see that Nimrod went from the east. So Nimrod went west, founded Babel. And then later Abram was called out of Ur of the Chaldees, which is in India. Those are actually Sanskrit words. Ur and Chaldee are Sanskrit words. And he went west and got out of Nimrod's empire. Do you understand? Nimrod's empire stretched from where Ham built his first city. Read the flood narrative. After the flood, Ham, Shem, and Japheth built settlements. And then later Nimrod went and founded a bunch of cities. Okay, but it says the beginning of his empire was these cities. It doesn't say he built the cities. So that's an interesting detail. But you see both Nimrod and Abram went west from the east into the Middle East. Okay? So when Abram got to the Middle East, he was speaking the same language as the people that were already there, and some of them were descended from Shem. But not all of them. A lot of them were descended from Ham by way of Canaan through Canaan, and through Nimrod and whatnot, okay? And yet they all spoke the same language. And so this Canaanite that they call of the Semitic language tree, that actually might be them trying to refer to the original language before the breaking of the languages at the Tower of Babel. Okay? So this language of Canaan might be a dialect of the original language that the whole world spoke. That's something to keep in mind. On the other hand, Canaanite was Hamite, not Shemite. So it's not Semitic. See, these Jews, they got it all twisted up. They call Hamite Shemite. They call Shemite satanic. They take and invent language over and over and over and call it pure language. They say we are Jews and we are Hebrews. Well, half the world, if not 90% of it, can say they're Hebrew. There's nothing special about that. And Jew is just the people who were wronged by parts of the tribes of Israel who were part Syrian and Canaanite. That's what Jews are. They're no more special than anyone else. Genetically, historically, linguistically, it's all equal. Besides the fact that when Yahushua HaMashiach came and leveled the playing field for everyone on this planet, everyone in this plane of existence, whether angel, demon, man, woman, slave, free, Israelite, not Israelite, God's people, not God's people, when Jesus died and rose again, he leveled the playing field. Everything got zeroed out. And I hope you can understand that. So, modern Hebrew, Middle Ages Hebrew, Mishnaic Hebrew are based on Babylonian, Hamite, Canaanite dialects that were created by Yahweh at the Tower of Babel event. Okay. And that's pretty much all you can say about it. You can't say anything else. The fact that in Daniel it says they spoke to the king in Aramaic, that's evidence that the previous king, the one who actually conquered Judah, didn't speak Aramaic. Okay, he probably spoke Syrian or Assyrian, in other words, Babylonian. This new king, Nebuchadnezzar, spoke Aramaic, which makes him actually a distant cousin of Israel. Okay, I hope you're following this. In the next video, I want to get into the historical record. It gets pretty interesting, and then I want to go on to some other topics about Hebrew, and then start, hopefully in the next video, I will start interjecting some of my observations that led me to look into this. It's pretty interesting, raises a lot of questions. Some of you already have the answers, you just don't know it. And some of it maybe can never be answered until we all know completely, you know. So, anywho, thanks for watching, and be blessed and bless.
I see the battle in your eyes. Bringing deep logic cause I'm sick of the ships. Bringing dirty cargo from the merchant of death. This world is a mirage and you're stuck in the system. The best you'll ever earn is an honorable mention. Don't waste your time on the usual stuff. Empty brain full of gut, your life is stuck in a rut. Debt your only aim as you stack in the debt. Merchandising masterminds collecting your checks.
Look in your eyes, I see moral frustration. Look at your life, I see no rejuvenation. See into your soul to hear battles not remembered. Only one word can make soul and spirit sever.
One word, one God, one life above all. True love we see, and our problems are small. All heaven, peace, sight us, we sing victory song. Osiris can't stop us from redeeming the mob. All people on the planet need to know the Creator. All people everywhere need to hear the red letters. One life sacrificed, and the war has been won. Every life sanctified in the name of the Son. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. The Word was God, was in the beginning with God. All things were made by it, without it nothing was made. In the Word was life, it is the light of all men. The Word is Jesus Christ, and He's coming again.
Look in your eyes, I see moral frustration. Look at your life, I see no rejuvenation. See into your soul to hear battles not remembered. Only one word can make soul and spirit severed.